Hi, everyone. So I'm Mike from Elzakker. I'm a biomedical researcher at Mass General Hospital. I also work with Mass Peace Action, so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But right now, we're going to introduce Lisa Guisbond and Jonathan King. Lisa is with the Citizens for Public Schools. Is going to talk a little bit about education in public schools. And Jonathan King is with MIT Biology. That's a little bit closer to the stuff I do, so I know a little bit more about it. The federal budget has a really big impact on Massachusetts specifically. Just for some sort of quick numbers, in 2016, the National Institute of Health provided $2.57 billion in federal funding to research institutions in Massachusetts alone. So it's a big chunk of what's important in Massachusetts, a lot of jobs in Massachusetts. Massachusetts General Hospital alone, where I work, received just under 800 grants worth just under $365 million. So it's a significant part of the operating expenses of an institution like that due to those indirect costs that we heard of before. And if budgets get cut for that sort of thing, the hospital has to make it up somewhere else. So maybe they're going to negotiate a little bit harder with the janitors union. Maybe they're going to raise prices somewhere else. There's this sort of ripple effect that we just heard about that ends up causing harms, for larger segments of the society. So I just want to introduce Lisa.
As was said, my organization is called Citizens for Public Schools, and we advocate for public education in Massachusetts, and we've been doing that since 1982. And we believe education is an essential pillar of our democracy because people can't participate in our democracy or our economy unless they have a good education. And can I just pause and ask, how many people in the room went to public schools? All right. Good. Excellent. So I have handouts on the table and with contact information. We have a website. We have a Facebook page. So I hope you'll visit and see more about our organization and take the handout with you. So our public schools have been tasked with greater, ever-growing expectations and challenges, and our students and teachers are constantly being asked to clear a higher and higher bar, often in the form of tests, high-stakes tests. Yet we've seen a steady erosion in the commitment to fully and equitably fund our public schools. And if that represents a failure to fulfill our constitutional mandate. Massachusetts Constitution says, and I quote, "Wisdom and knowledge as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. It shall be the duty of legislatures and magistrates to cherish the public schools and grammar schools in the towns." But contrary to cherishing, we learned in 2015 from a nonpartisan state foundation budget review commission that our schools are underfunded to the tune of about at least $1 billion a year. At least $1 billion a year, and other estimates are as high as $2 billion underfunded. So the commission found that the budget does not accurately reflect the increasing costs of things like healthcare and special education and other things. So there are several bills in the state legislature now to implement the recommendations of this commission, but they remain stalled, that they haven't moved forward. So since substantial public education funding comes from the state, especially for low-income districts, CPS, along with our allies in a coalition called the Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance, support legislation to address these recommendations. But we also believe the state needs to pass a fair share amendment. How many people have heard about the fair share amendment? So that'll be on the ballot in November 2018. It would raise revenue for education and public transportation by permitting an additional 4% on the portion of income above $1 million a year in any given year. So those of you who make more than $1 million in the audience, You, ma'am, the amount you make over $1 million will be taxed an additional 4%. So as I said, substantial publication funding comes from the state, the vast majority from state and local funds, but the federal government's contribution, while less than 8% of elementary and secondary education funding, is nonetheless significant and supports essential services. But the truth is, and here I'm going to get to this intersectionality idea that keeps popping up, if we really care about public education, we have to look beyond education funding specifically. We know from decades of research that a child's success in school or a child's circumstances outside of school has enormous impact on their success inside of school. So currently, 1 out of about every $4, or Lindsay said 28% of the overall state budget comes from the federal government. Thus, federal threats to even non-education funding like Medicaid and SNAP, supplemental nutrition assistance, could leave a very big budget hole, as has already been mentioned several times, for state dollars to fill, which could in turn affect funding in all budget areas. It's important to understand what is the general direction, as has been said, of budget proposals to make up for the lost revenue from the recently passed tax cuts. For the wealthy, and that direction is to make deep, deep cuts to programs that benefit the poor and the middle class. So I'll just name some of the programs that are at risk, some of the education-related programs. Title I funds for schools with low-income students, as well as after-school programs, arts programs, anti-bullying programs, school counseling. Massachusetts currently receives $236 million in Title I supports, billions of dollars from Pell Grants and financial aid and the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, hundreds of millions of dollars that could be shifted from district public schools to private school vouchers and charters, staffing for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, and regulation protecting the rights of students of color, LGBTQ, and students with special needs. Also at risk, vital funding for students with learning disabilities. The state of Massachusetts receives $290 million in federal grants for special education that gets distributed to local school districts. Massachusetts already also receives $240 million in federal grants for free and reduced price meals. And these programs risk complete elimination, $40 million in teacher quality grants for teacher training, and $16 million for 21st century learning centers. So on Tuesday, I had the opportunity to testify at the Massachusetts State House before the Revenue Committee on the impact of extending federal tax benefits to 529 funds spent on K through 12 private education. And you may all be familiar with 521 funds that were originally developed as a way for families to save for college education, and they are overwhelmingly used by wealthier families. But we believe that for these tax-favored plans to be used for private K through 12 education is a step towards U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos's dream of shifting money out of traditional public schools and towards private and religious schools. So I urge the Revenue Committee to continue to allow 529 contributions to be deducted for qualifying higher education expenses, but not allow them to be deducted for K through 12 expenses. And to my pleasure, the committee was receptive to these concerns. Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research also testified at the hearing that the Republican tax plan has deliberately targeted liberal states like Massachusetts that provide better public services and have higher tax rates. They have higher tax rates so they can provide better public services. And as we've heard, but I'll repeat it because that's a good pedagogical technique, repetition. The result is a windfall for wealthy taxpayers at the expense of programs for the poor and programs that support the common good. So another little piece of good news here is that the Revenue Committee was, as I said, very receptive to the concerns that I and my fellow panelists raised about the potential negative impact on funding for public education. And, overall, they were receptive to a lot of the concerns that were expressed about the need for the state to respond to the extent that it's able to, the damage that's going to be done by these federal tax cuts. So, thank you.